All right. Hello.
Hey, how you doing?
Good. You?
Good.
Let's see. Let me just triple check that I've got my audio right.
Uh-oh, what are you wearing?
Uh-oh. Blue.
Am I cramping your aesthetic again? Dude, is that like the
Oh,
same shirt?
maybe.
Oh my gosh.
Oh, that's hilarious. This just got even better.
Yeah, that was totally unintentional.
How wonderful. Okay, so have you used Zoom before?
Yeah, I use it pretty frequently.
Okay. Good. And you can hear me,
Yep, it's all
I
good.
presume? Okay.
Yeah, how does my video look?
It looks fine.
Yeah. Is
And
it
mine?
looking... Yeah, yours is good.
Okay. All righty. Well, let's see. So we're recording now, so I guess we'll just start, but I want this to be more like a conversation.
Hmm.
But part of like if you haven't already caught on, like I see, I don't know, like within apologetics and like that kind of circuit, it seems like debate is the big thing. And that's
Yeah.
fine and dandy, but like I've noticed that a lot of the time, especially like it happens with the like official debates, but also with just general online discourse, that it just turns into a dumpster fire.
Yeah,
And
for sure. I agree.
two things too is like, number one, something that I always find interesting is that each opposing side either wants to like beat the other person or persuade the other person.
Hmm.
And it seems to me that like, I don't know. I feel like there's an air of arrogance there that like, I'm going to convince you tonight, you know?
Hmm.
Um, so that's kind of led me to want to do these kind of videos.
Hmm. Yeah, that's understandable. And yeah, I recently have tried to engage in more just like face-to-face dialogues with different Christians. Like it's something I've enjoyed doing for many years now. But like at ASU, for instance, there's two different Christian groups that I've been kind of involved with, and they've led to some very fruitful conversations where I feel like I'm able to walk away understanding them better, they're understanding, me better, and our respective worldviews. And actually, just today and yesterday, I attended a conference with a group of them. It's called the Sacred Words Conference. It was um, can't remember the exact name of the organization it was through, but they have like Logos, like Bible software. They have like the
Mm,
Gospel Coalition. They have a couple different like Christian groups represented there. And the keynote speaker was Daniel Wallace, the New Testament dude.
I've heard of
Um,
him.
yeah, he's pretty world renowned. And so there's some other like kind of high level, more like evangelical scholars. But so I went in pretty skeptical, both being a Mormon, but then also being like more like in terms of like academia, like more left leaning and like biased towards like the secular academy. And so I was interested to see what I would think. And I was actually very impressed. I thought their scholarship was very rigorous. They were reasonable. I didn't feel like it was apologetic in like a mental gymnastics type sense.
Hmm.
It was there is very little, if anything, like, obviously I would reach like different conclusions than they would, but as far as like presenting and handling the data, I thought it was pretty flawless, and it's something that I really respected, them for doing. So it was cool.
That's awesome to hear. And kind of like just sort of the general spirit of what you're doing is something that I think we really need to do, because like there was a Facebook post recently that you and I interacted on, and it's like no matter what you post that is religious or political, it's going to become a dumpster fire
Yeah,
more
for sure.
times than not.
Yeah, for sure.
And again, like part of why I've done this is like, since it feels like to me that since 2014, 2015, just anybody on the opposite side is an enemy.
Yeah.
And I don't know, it's like not every Thanksgiving needs to be a battle, you know?
Yeah,
And I think more,
I technically mark it in 2016 with the martyrdom of Harambe. That's when I start, saying that the world,
or you
moved to
Harambe. Dicks out for Harambe.
yeah.
Yeah, that's hilarious. Yeah, the legacy of Harambe has actually lasted a lot longer than I thought. So,
Oh yeah, for sure. Like he's he's basically a saint now, and you know,
in
it's like
in the
his
meme
own
kingdom.
cult of worship.
Let's see. So where to start? Oh, and then one last thing that I think would be kind of interesting to talk about, sort of an aside, because we've got the general three topics, but something that I'm curious about is, so I grew up, and I don't know, maybe we start here, just
I'm happy just to talk about whatever,
okay.
so wherever the conversation goes.
Well, something that is interesting to me is like I grew up LDS and then went my own way,
Hmm.
but it's like I live in Utah, so of course
Right.
becoming atheist, Hindu, Christian, whatever, it's like all of my energy has been directed toward Mormons.
Hmm.
And I've noticed the more like out there I've gotten online with like chat groups and stuff like that, I've had more interactions with Protestants.
Hmm.
And as much as we have in common, I find it very interesting the things that we have in common, of course, like Christology and that stuff. But as far as like leadership and ecclesiastical stuff, I'm like, I find more common ground with the Mormons on
Right.
that kind of end of things, as far as
Right.
there being a capital C church that is corporate, that's not the invisible church.
Yeah, like an
And
institution and like a hierarchy and stuff like
exactly.
that. Yeah.
So I just find like, because the whole spirit of this is like, okay, we disagree. We're going to talk about what we disagree, but we should also talk about what we agree on. And
Hmm.
so I find that kind of an interesting bullet point.
Yeah. Yeah, and I've certainly found the same thing. I haven't dialogued with as many Catholics or Orthodox Christians, so a lot of my time has been spent with the evangelical community. Just because
Mm-hmm.
when I was 12, my mom converted to non-denominational Christianity out of Mormonism, and so my family became like an interfaith family. Me and my siblings would go to both churches during the week, and so through like kind of my high school experience, I was kind of equally involved in both faith traditions and communities.
That's interesting.
Yeah, so that gave me a lot of time to get to come to understand, non-denominationals and evangelical Protestants.
Yeah, and I wonder what it is about for the Protestants in general, just that aversion to, I mean, maybe with the exemption of Lutherans and Anglicans slash Episcopalians, but just this aversion to a, I don't know what, a institutional or corporate side
Yeah.
of church, you know?
Yeah. Well, just in terms of like denominations, they did used to have like a bigger emphasis, and as far as like denominations were concerned, like what like take the 19th century for instance.
Mm-hmm.
You'd have sentiments more commonly espoused within particular sects or denominations of Christianity that our denomination is the one true church, right? And so even if there wasn't like a set hierarchy, there's still the sense of like denominations were important. But since then, there's been a widespread like kind of ecumenical movement to kind of reach across the aisle, and most evangelicals I know, even if they disagree with the personal politics, of an Episcopalian, and different ways that their church functions, they can still fundamentally, depending on the Episcopalian, of course, agree on the nature of Christ, and they would consider them within the body of Christ.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, that's been interesting because I think that implicates like contemporary Mormon missionary work, right? Because I think it's safe to say that it's still operating off of the assumption that kind of it doesn't matter which region of the world you're in, right? The curriculum for missionaries is the same. The
Yeah.
same the same the question that missionaries are trying to get people to ask and find an answer to is which of all the churches is right, and
Mm-hmm.
that's where you see Joseph Smith's personal narrative utilized so like prioritized so much, even though in like the early LDS church, the first vision and kind of Joseph Smith's early story didn't it didn't play that kind of role in missionary work. It was the Book of Mormon, and it was kind of like this claim of like a golden Bible, or a lost book of scripture that people would get converted to first, but then also like claiming that like the church was restored, and you'd have converts or missionaries referring to like different proof texted verses within the New Testament to try to say like, this is what the primitive Christian church looks like, and we don't see that today, and where can we find that? We find that in the Mormons, right? Granted, that was like largely in the 1830s, I would say, that kind of missionary work. Once you hit the 1840s with Joseph Smith's more distinct doctrines, especially like, once the saints live in Nauvoo, and especially once they move west, that kind of primary identity of like a restoration of the primitive Christian church, I think gets put on the back burner a little bit, and Mormons get defined more by their distinctive practices, most explicitly polygamy. So yeah, I think it's interesting, and I think probably the LDS Church, it would do them some good to diversify their missionary approaches a bit, because like I said, a lot of Protestants, they're not asking who belongs to the right institutional church, because they have a conception of the body of Christ, and frankly, like a lot of like young millennials who probably lean secular or something like that, they're probably not asking themselves that question either.
Yeah.
So each generation kind of has their own question, or like their own pressing needs, and often through religious history, you might see a new religious movement spring up that has many times perhaps a compelling answer to some of those needs, but that doesn't always maintain the same momentum, because society changes its it changes what it views itself as missing.
Yeah. I mean, that's an interesting idea, because it kind of resonates with a recent interaction I had with one of my priests, and we were talking about how, like, I'm reading Saint Irenaeus or Saint John of Damascus, and it's like basically what he says is like, absolutely read those guys, but you have to, just like when you're examining scripture, it's like you have to be very careful, because they're operating with different language,
context,
different culture, everything. So he said, like, don't be afraid to lean more on modern day saints, modern day elders and bishops and fathers who really can speak to your needs, the needs of the culture, and with the language that we're using. And that's something in my own studies with like my master's thesis on the ante-Nicene church, is like, if I say that the persons of the Trinity are homoousios, they have the same essence, or if I say hypostasis, it's like nobody really knows what that means.
Right.
It's a totally different vocabulary from a totally different context, language. So part of my thesis is like representing the Trinity with modern terminology, and for our own culture now. Basically.
That's cool. Yeah, and you don't even have to get into complex terms like homoousios and hypostasis for people to get lost pretty quickly today, right?
Oh yeah.
When I was at ASU, I saw just this week an evangelical street preaching on campus, and he's just using terms like justified and sanctified and stuff like that. But people walking by, they don't probably understand what that means. And he wasn't taking any time throughout the course of his preaching the word to define those terms and bring it down to a level that most people walking by would be able to understand. I was able to talk to different students that were listening to him, and they were like confused at like what he was trying to say. And it reminded me, I don't know exactly where the passage was. Oh, in the parable of the sower, I think it's in Jesus's explanation about the seed that falls on hard ground. I think he says something along the lines that it represents those who heard the word but understood it not. You know,
Yeah.
so it's not necessarily that they didn't even hear it. It's the understanding, you know, that they might have been lacking.
Hmm.
And that's where, yeah, it could be very helpful to, like, I think this is true for kind of every religious movement. Like I said, with the generations changing, the societal views changing, it's important for each religious tradition to keep itself relevant and to keep itself updated in the language and the I don't know, kind of the way of thinking, you know. And I'm not trying to say that they need to bow to the world or anything like that, but they certainly need to make sure that what they're presenting can be understood and, you know, can address the significant concerns of the people that they're trying to reach.
Yeah, I would agree there to an extent, and I think you and I agree, but just the only asterisk I would put there is the church is not meant to be of this world, and so it
Yeah, of
depends on the
course.
kind. Like if you're talking about the way that you communicate, the way that you phrase things, that kind of thing. But I don't know, when you see the Catholics like venerating Pachamama or some of these what are they called, clown masses, some of these like innovations that in my opinion make a mockery of the
Hmm.
church. And I think we have to be very careful
Yeah,
where that
yeah,
line is, for
of
sure.
course. I think I was speaking more conceptually, like as far as theology is concerned.
Yeah,
But
communicating it, I
yeah,
think.
yeah.
Well, let's see. I was thinking on how to start, and I think starting with the Book of Mormon would probably be best, because the
Hmm.
Book of Mormon, I think, would lead us into apostolic succession, which might lead us into like great apostasy, nature of the Godhead, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
But I think the
Hmm.
Book of Mormon might be the best place to start. I'm not sure
Yeah.
how to start, but I think
Yeah.
that's
Cool.
probably the place to start.
Well, how about I start with asking you a question? Because I am curious, as someone who, you know, is a former Mormon. You know, how do you make like, how do you understand the Book of Mormon now? Like, how has your perspective changed? Obviously, you know, I think it's safe to assume that you once viewed it as scripture, right? But now, like, how would you consider it? You know, how do you kind of see it coming into production? You know, like, how does it come to be, you know, versus its kind of traditional narrative? um, yeah, I'm interested in that.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I did believe it was scripture
Hmm.
through my early years, but to get more to the question, the way that I view it now, there are a lot of hypotheses out there,
Right.
and there's not so much information. I'm pretty
Hmm.
sure you'll know everything that I'm about to talk about, but like,
Yeah.
so there's the Solomon Spalding theory,
Hmm.
and it's like there's some interesting stuff there, but it also depends on like what your sources are and the credibility of those sources.
Hmm.
So I would say that I'm open to the Solomon Spalding theory, but there's not enough in that to sink my teeth into.
Hmm.
I find, um, as far as like authorship, not authorship, I influence. I find the late war and A View of the Hebrews to be more um, convincing as far as like where some of the ideas came from. I
Hmm.
know there are theories about Sidney Rigdon and Oliver Cowdery helping to write the Book of Mormon.
Hmm.
And I find that to be more convincing. But again, then we come to the point of, well, what's your proof? And there are some quotes, but they don't seem to be super credible. So
Hmm.
a lot of that kind of falls back onto conjecture.
Hmm.
Um, so as far as like going down a concrete road of my thoughts, I would say the parallels between the late war and A View of the Hebrews are very telling. Um, and I think and I mean, the other two things too, the Book of Abraham, of course, and Joseph Smith's quote unquote translation of the Holy Bible. I find those to be problematic. And I have spent a lot of time on Fair Mormon, and they sometimes have good answers or comebacks, such as with the Solomon Spaulding theory, or with like whether or not Sidney Rigdon and Oliver Cowdery helped write the Book of Mormon. So that, but then a lot of the other things I find to be spin, for lack of a better way to term it. And I mean no offense by that.
We've already found common ground.
Well, there you go. So I think my exegesis of Fair Mormon needs to be just as scrutinous as anything else. And then let's see where else. So just basically, like, because for me, and I'm getting close to the end here, but for me, I really honestly tried. I really tried to have that burning testimony. I really tried. And if it was like one thing or two things, but it's just like there are so many things that continually kept coming up, and there either wasn't an answer or there wasn't a good answer. And so that was, I think, fairly instrumental in me losing interest in the faith. And then lastly, from a theological perspective, now that I've actually done the homework, so to speak, not on the LDS side, but on the Christian side, it's my perspective that Joseph Smith and his close associates were trying to restore something that didn't need restoring. I can understand absolutely why they felt that there was a need for a restoration. And, you know, you could make a case like, well, why wasn't the Orthodox Church in America? Technically it was, but it was mostly in Alaska. Right. So, yeah, I mean, I don't have clear answers for some of that stuff, but that's a good first broad stroke.
Yeah. So, yeah, So as far as some of the things that you said, let me discuss what I think are the most compelling, perhaps like naturalistic or like alternative explanations for the Book of Mormon. Right? I don't necessarily hold to them myself, but you know, in terms of like, I want to identify what I feel is like the strongest case kind of against it, you know, in a traditional sense.
Case against the Book of Mormon?
Yeah.
Okay, interesting.
It's not my point of view personally, but in terms of like even recommending you know, some different positions to you. So, you know, I do think that clearly like the Spaulding, you know, the late war and the view of the Hebrews, those are all, especially the Spaulding manuscript, that's a very traditional criticism.
Yeah.
And while there, you know, while it did have kind of an edge to it for a little bit, right? As soon as they discovered the actual manuscript, very, very quickly the theory fell apart, just because, you know, people were able to read both texts and see that, if anything, they had kind of a superficial bearing on each other, but not enough to necessarily even establish like a strong like narrative reliance, if that makes sense. And I've read the Solomon text, and so like, you know, generally like it talks about like a group of Romans which get blown off course and you know, kind of land in the New World, and it's interesting for sure, and it does kind of employ a similar biblical King James type language. But yeah, I quickly felt like it was not credible, and regardless of like personal interpretation, just in terms of like the world of Mormon studies in general, like the academic world of Mormon studies, I can't think of any scholars, Mormon or not, that would espouse the Spaulding theory as like being a credible one.
Yeah.
It's been debunked essentially for a while. And so, you know, it's one that unfortunately is persistent, and there's like, every now and then you'll get like a random evangelical apologist or scholar that wants to argue it. But I just don't see it having any edge. Once we move to like the Great War and the view of the Hebrews, I think that's a slightly different story. I think there's, especially as far as the view of the Hebrews is concerned, it's probably more likely that you'll find some narrative parallels between the two texts. The view of the Hebrews, essentially like being an explanation of the 10 tribes, the lost 10 tribes being found within the native populaces of the Americas. So, and even beyond, going beyond just the view of the Hebrews, within the 19th century, that was a kind of a popular explanation for where the Native Americans came from.
Yeah.
Right, was this idea that they were of like an Israelite descent, specifically that they were of the lost 10 tribes.
Mm-hmm.
And you even had rhetoric about perhaps white populations and darker populations warring with each other. And so the view of the Hebrews kind of covers that. It talks about multiple civilizations, two of which battle each other, and one that tends to be more civilized than the other. And so we can see some like kind of broader narrative parallels. But in terms of like textual reliance, I don't think anyone also within the Mormon studies community, same with the Great War too. The Great War employs the King James type language, but it's like a retelling of the Napoleonic Wars. So yeah, there's some similarities there, whether it's some narrative kind of broader themes that are similar, or perhaps the style, because the Book of Mormon wasn't the only example of literature from the 19th century which employed King James type language in order to elevate kind of the way it
And that
sounded,
was popular
right?
at the time.
Yeah, that was a style of writing, and especially in terms of scripture, how scripture was viewed. Anyone that was doing translation work like that was seen as the more perhaps like regal or royal kind of English language to use. The fancier. So I think if one is gonna take more of a naturalistic position on the Book of Mormon, and I would assume that like you would likely be more comfortable espousing. Well, let me put it this way. I've come across some evangelicals that are like, the Book of Mormon is inspired, right? But it's inspired of the devil, and like they put this heavy emphasis on like kind of like Satan, and even though they might recognize like the miraculous or complex nature of it, they're still like, Satan was the one to do it, right? If you don't want to go that route, that's fine. I think a naturalistic argument that one could make is that within the 19th century, you have this kind of really strong culture of like biblical memorization. All right. Where more so than our culture today, people were absolutely steeped in the language and the kind of environment of the Bible, right? Especially the King James text, where many people, whether in sermons or whether in just discourses or things like that, it would be pretty popular for people to just throw a couple strings of King James type phrases or things like that out, as they speak in formal settings, or if they're doing a sermon or even a text or something like that. So you have this culture of memorization of the Bible, and there's a stronger oral emphasis on those type of skills than in our day, right? Rhetoric essentially meant something more. The kind of literary culture just wasn't the same as today, right? And so the emphasis was placed more on orality. So with those things in mind, I think one probably could take, and people do, I think respectable non-Mormon scholars do take the position that the Book of Mormon was like an authentic dictation from Joseph Smith, authentic in the sense that he wasn't just merely plagiarizing from somewhere else, or he wasn't there just isn't strong evidence that he's getting a lot of help or any from other potential authors. I know you mentioned Sidney Rigdon.
Yeah.
Problem with him is that he doesn't meet Joseph Smith for until after the Book of Mormon is published, and so there's a chronological inconsistency there that for people who want to argue that route, it's a really big hurdle for them to get past. And so, yeah, Sidney Rigdon likely isn't, almost certainly isn't involved with it. If you want to go with Oliver Cowdery, Oliver is a school teacher, so his education is higher than Joseph's. So I think you could maybe make the case that Oliver Cowdery is helping him perhaps refine some of the language. But Oliver Cowdery isn't the only scribe that's used. Emma Smith is also used. You have David Whitmer. You have
Martin
I think
Harris.
At least Martin Harris. You have at least
Early
a half
on.
dozen scribes. Yeah.
Yeah.
Not just with the extant text, but with the missing manuscript too. So it gets complex pretty fast. But it seems. So all potential sources aside, the one thing that the Mormon studies community, both Mormon and non-Mormon, are pretty committed on, and I think it's completely undeniable, is that the Book of Mormon has a textual reliance on the King James Bible, both in terms of the long passages, such as the Isaiah passages, or even in the language that it employs. It's very stylistic and it sounds pretty King James. But you very quickly see this kind of like textual dependence, or at least influence on the King James Bible, not just the Old Testament, not just the stuff that chronologically the internal narrative the authors would have had access to, like the pre-exilic or even maybe some exilic writings, but also New Testament stuff, right? So that's where it becomes complex pretty quickly. So yeah, I think a respectable position that I don't personally hold is that it is a work of let me take that back. The I don't personally hold it.
Yeah.
Because in some senses, I'm open to the view, but it becomes complicated within my position of faith to fully espouse it, because I do believe that Joseph Smith had a creative hand in the production of the Book of Mormon. But I also do believe that there's, it has a very, how do I put this? I'm somewhat agnostic to its historicity. I do find its historicity to be a pretty important hinge point on the validity of its truth claims and on Joseph Smith's prophetic truth claims.
Yeah.
But in terms of pointing to a particular ancient culture and saying these were Nephites, or, this is the geography where the Book of Mormon took place, I wouldn't be able to do that with any kind of full confidence, right? There's places where I think you could make plausible arguments for, but I want to be very careful to qualify my claims. I do consider it to be inspired. I do consider it to be scripture. And I do believe that without that inspiration, it would be like, I see the inspiration as being kind of an explanatory factor for the complexity that I find in the text, just because I'm not sure that there's super strong evidence that Joseph Smith had the means of himself to produce it. There's people who argue that he did produce it, and they don't attribute a supernatural element to it. Let me see, I lost my train of thought. Yeah, because they don't attribute a supernatural element to his dictation. It's like a naturalistic position. And so they explain it as a work of creative genius, a religious genius, right? Which, just because who is it, like Mozart, or there's been people, prodigy type people throughout the world,
Sure.
that even though they're one in a million, or super unique, and it seems that their skills and abilities transcend normal humans, right? They still happen, right? So it's not impossible. And I do recognize that as a hypothetical possibility with Joseph Smith, that perhaps his religious genius, his ability for, either, so like there's a memorization component, but then also kind of like narrative creativity and dictation. Perhaps that was to such a level that he was able to single-handedly, without a supernatural influence, produce the narrative text of the Book of Mormon. Yeah, so I do hold that technically as a possibility, but because I do have kind of a spiritual commitment to the text, I've had kind of spiritual experiences with it. I do personally believe that it has deepened my relationship with Jesus Christ, and so there's that personal, subjective, like spiritual,
Hmm.
element of my relationship to the text, that I do find not. I don't just personally find inspiration in it, but I do find, because I believe in the supernatural personally, and I hold it to be inspired, that there was a level of divine inspiration in its production. Um, I do think, there's plausible arguments for different historical, like ancient elements of the text, that I think are rather interesting. But in terms of nailing it down and saying like this is where it took place or with this civilization, I don't think that's within our current bounds to do. So that's essentially like a lot of information on like kind of my position of the Book
Yeah.
of Mormon. But yeah, I'm interested, kind of like what you might think about that, or yeah, just your response, or how that might square with maybe your prior views as a Mormon, or some of the views that you've heard by Latter-day Saints today.
Sure. Quick follow-up, maybe a little
Yeah.
clarification though. So let's see, what was it that you said? Correct me, but did you say that you were agnostic as to whether or not Joseph Smith had a creative hand with composing or dictating the Book of Mormon?
No, I do believe that he has personal influence in the production of the text.
And
I, like
how so?
you want me to qualify that?
Don't,
So
I'm not asking you to like
yeah,
prove it or something. I'm just
yeah.
like, do you have an example or what you're thinking of?
Yeah, so besides just in his own lifetime, clear like textual examples of him going back to the text and perhaps making like a minor emendation or something like that, which demonstrates that there was a level of flexibility to the text. Like he didn't hold it to an inerrant standard, because he himself and others, might make grammatical changes. They might make clarifications of particular words. None of which significantly change meaning. A couple of them could be argued to, change meaning a bit, but none which, there was no, the first edition of the Book of Mormon is the final edition, essentially. There's not this huge, there's not a rough draft with a huge, like, final revision. There's grammatical stuff and, perhaps like a dozen small textual changes, but in terms of the narrative structure, there was no rewrite. There was no, it was very different than how we might think of contemporary, perhaps like fiction writers,
Yeah.
where they go through a long, extensive process of trying to refine the text. So besides that, I do see 19th century, uniquely 19th century, and not just 19th century, but ancient concepts or terms in the text, right? That are anachronistic, that belong
Yeah.
outside of the narrative time frame that the Book of Mormon claims to cover. So some of those have, reflect perhaps like Protestant ideology, different terms. There's different ways in which the Book of Mormon does, fit nicely within the religious milieu of Joseph Smith. There's other ways in which it goes very counter to it. But for instance, take like the judgment bar of God. for instance, that language, that idea of a judgment bar, where one, if they were convicted, would stand trial. There was a physical bar in which they would, be at when they're in the courtroom. That wasn't an ancient concept. That was developed much later. I don't know the exact century, let's say 17th, 18th, 19th century,
Sure.
Essentially like, at least 1,000 years after the time frame of the Book of Mormon, right? That doesn't become like a concept. So both in terms of like some of the language used in the Book of Mormon, but then some of the theological concepts, I would say as well, seem to reflect like Protestant ideals. And there's, people have remarked that, the other truth claims of Mormonism aside, the Book of Mormon does in a lot of ways read like a small o Orthodox Christian text, in the sense that a lot of Christians could read it, be like, wow, I actually agree with a lot here. There's not, it doesn't seem like there's these huge distinctions, just right off the bat in Mormon theology. It does seem compatible with different Protestant theological concepts in different ways. So, in cases like that, I think there's a potential for Joseph Smith to have a creative hand.
How would that affect how does that affect your belief in the Book of Mormon, though? Because my understanding is that when he was reading the words, he had his face in the hat and he was looking through the Urim and Thummim into the bottom of the hat. And my understanding is that the words that like correlated to the text would appear. And so it was like a word for word translation. And so that's where it became concerning to me that I think the number, it's become almost a catchphrase, but it's like the Book of Mormon has undergone 3,000 changes since publication. And yet it was purported to be the most correct.
Than that, but yeah.
Yeah. So, and it's purported to be the most, it was and still is, I think, purported to be the most correct book of any book on earth.
Yeah.
And so because I've interacted with probably a lot of the same type of ferocious Protestants that you have, and I've seen the accusations with that. And I'll give you the benefit of the doubt that like most of the changes, sure, are relatively superficial, but then again, it's like, well, if it was a word for word translation, why make those changes to begin with? And then there are changes that are more significant. I can't name any off the top of my head, but if I recall right, and if you know, please correct me, but some of the elements within the Book of Mormon that were alleged to have had a racist connotation, like fair and delightsome skin, to my understanding, those were altered.
There's one passage in particular that was changed from white and delightsome to pure and delightsome within Joseph Smith's lifetime. He personally made that emendation. And it's understood that the reason he did that was probably because he didn't want it to be misunderstood as having like a racial component there. So we do have like a few that like, and that's what I was saying with like probably a dozen instances or so. That one you could argue affects meaning somewhat, not in like a super important doctrinal sense, but it nonetheless affects, how one reads the text in a more meaningful way than just, let's say, grammar or syntax or something. There's other ones. I know that there was one in First Nephi and a vision that Nephi sees where Mary, if you recall, Nephi has the vision of the tree of life, and Mary is also shown in the vision. She's described, I think, in the earliest text as the mother of God, and later that is changed to the mother of the Son of God. So there's there's a small change there, and maybe in a few other places, kind of similar changes.
I don't have anything pulled up here, but I know that it's a common thing used against the authenticity of the Book of Mormon, that apparently there was more of a maybe soft Trinitarianism, that Trinitarian theology was present in the early versions of the Book of Mormon, but that got weeded out over time.
I think you could still read it and find that kind of soft Trinitarianism if that's the lens that you're viewing through. Contemporary Latter-day Saints, because they don't identify as Trinitarians, would probably read it through the lens of their own,
Sure.
theological understanding. So, and that's the thing. Like when you talk about like the Godhead and the Trinity, often, except in some very like more technical cases, Mormons can talk about the Godhead as being three and one, and qualifying it in terms of unity and stuff like that. So
Social Trinity.
yeah, social Trinity perhaps. So to answer your question or go back in terms of like my view of the translation process of the Book of Mormon, I don't think that the textual evidence that we have supports a word-to-word translation. Even though you are correct that there are early accounts that seem to describe that. The thing is, all the accounts, let me put it this way. Joseph Smith, throughout his life, never described the translation of the Book of Mormon beyond this, claiming that it was by the gift and the power of God. He never said it was word for word, sentence for sentence, or idea for idea. All the accounts of how the technicalities of the translation process, those are all secondhand. Some of them do come from scribes, which were in the room, and so you can kind of make the argument or assume that perhaps they were told that by Joseph Smith. We don't have any of them claiming that Joseph Smith personally told them that, but you'll have different individuals say that he put his face in the hat. He had the seer stone. And he read like word for word, verbatim, the words would appear on the stone, kind of like it would illuminate the darkness within the hat. They would appear on the stone, and Joseph Smith would say that, or in the case of like proper names, he would spell them out. And some accounts even describe him as not being able to continue his dictation unless the name was properly spelled. So I think there's actually reason to doubt some of those claims. Let me cover a couple other descriptions though. So there's other accounts where it was sentence for sentence, where an entire passage would appear to Joseph and he would say it. In the missing manuscript period, the part of the text that is not extant, that we don't have, the kind of Book of Lehi, as it's popularly called. The description there by Martin Harris is that Joseph would hang a sheet in the middle of the room, and that's where he would wear the Urim and Thummim, the breastplate, and the spectacles, which he did not continue to use through the extant portion of the Book of Mormon. He used the seer stone for that. He would hang a sheet in the middle of the room, wear the Urim and Thummim, and essentially like recent scholars who have done a lot of kind of textual reconstruction of the narrative of the Book of Lehi, the missing manuscript. Essentially, they argue that that Joseph Smith took on the role of an Israelite high priest. Like it became like a kind of a temple type space, that translation room, where you would have a curtain. And you would have Joseph wearing kind of this breastplate identified as the Urim and Thummim. And the spectacles, or I forget exactly the technicality of it, but think of it as like a projector. The light from there would be a light that's projected onto the it's the spectacles. Sorry. Yeah, the spectacles were described as convex, and so they would cast a light essentially on the sheet, and Joseph would see, the finger of God, or would see the words appearing on the sheet and read them off to his scribe. And then you have others who weren't necessarily scribes, but you have Brigham Young, for instance, saying that if Joseph Smith sought to retranslate the Book of Mormon again in the time in which Brigham is saying this quote, He said if Joseph, chose to retranslate the Book of Mormon for the saints today, it would look a lot different than, the Book of Mormon that we presently have. So throughout the Latter-day Saint tradition, you have a couple different kind of schools of thought about the technicalities of the translation process. Not all of them are compatible with each other. There are those that lean more towards kind of a verbatim, like word for word type thing. There's some that seem more conceptual, where Joseph Smith has more of a creative hand in it. But I just think textually, like, theories aside, and kind of the witnesses aside, I think textually it's more defensible that Joseph Smith had a heavier creative hand in it. And you can interpret that as perhaps, he never saw words, right? And because he never saw words, even though people thought he did, that's perhaps an indication that, he was just making it up as he goes along. Those who don't consider the process, that process to invalidate his translation claims, would say that, it was just those in the room or those trying to make sense of the translation process that misunderstood what was going on, but that we can demonstrate. They would still hold to the inspiration of the Book of Mormon, but they'd say that it's more defensible textually that Joseph had a creative hand in it, because he went back and either individuals on his behalf or he throughout his life would make some of these changes as he saw fit. And it wasn't just isolated to the Book of Mormon. He did that for the Doctrine and Covenants. He did that for the Joseph Smith translation of the Bible. Throughout his different scriptural projects, there seems to be this fluidity or flexibility of his scriptural views, where he feels free to, within, under inspiration, make inspired emendations or changes or modifications to the text. So, I think it's interesting. There's not a current consensus among Mormon scholars, or frankly non-Mormon scholars too, about how he pulled it off. It seems very clear that Joseph dictated it. That's definitely consistent. But in terms of like the technicalities of the translation process, I don't know that there's a present consensus for it, although there's competing theories. I would lean more to the one that said not kind of a word for word verbatim translation, because I would consider that problematic, because I think that you would also have to bring up questions of, what about these supposed anachronisms in the text, or these things that were later changed, right? Does that mean God, got it wrong the first time, right? So I don't know. It's a fascinating conversation for sure. There's a lot of rabbit holes to it.
Yeah, and I let's see. I'll respond to that and then go back to the original question.
Yeah, that's all good.
Just personally, I find a lot of that kind of problematic.
Yeah.
Especially with the changes that happened. And the only clear example I can remember was the last time that I was like reading the Book of Mormon, because like whenever I have a conversation or something, like I'll prepare and I'll read parts of it. But the last time that I read the Book of Mormon, I came to a part, I think in the Book of Moses, where he talks about like how baptizing babies is like horrible and you should not do this. And I'm like,
that's in Moroni.
Okay, yeah.
Actually,
but I just found it really interesting that
it's in one of them. Yeah.
This is something that I should have done already, but I haven't. But it's like baptizing babies, like that seems like a very distinct North American Protestant issue going on at that time.
For sure.
I would be curious, and here's where it's like I would be curious to see if there actually was infant baptism prior to the early Christian church. Perhaps there was, but I found that to be interesting. So the interesting one that you brought up was whether or not there was influence of the demonic in the dictation of the Book of Mormon. Kind of like the Solomon Spalding theory, and he wrote it with Sidney Rigdon and Cowdery. It's like I find him writing the Book of Mormon with the help of Cowdery and Rigdon to be probable, but like I said, I'm very forthright in the evidence isn't quite there. So I don't
Yeah.
know. But
Yeah.
so I hold a similarly. I don't rule out the influence of the demonic in Joseph Smith's dictation of or creation of the Book of Mormon, and part of why I only feel a little bit more confident in expressing that as a possibility is just because of the similarities between Joseph Smith and Muhammad. And I
Interesting.
can definitely say I feel very confident saying that Muhammad was a false prophet through and through.
Mm.
And so, and there's some very, very scary, interesting things that took place with Muhammad's creation of the Quran and this what was it? The angel Gabriel.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like I don't know, like
What essentially like the story where Muhammad is on Mount Hijra, I think,
and
or
he was going to commit suicide.
um,
He was going to
yeah,
jump off.
yeah, but essentially that's where he feels like this overwhelming presence, that he attributes to the angel Gabriel, who grabs him or shakes him or does some type of constraining action on him, saying
Yeah.
like recite, right, and recite, and Muhammad's like he's not learned, he can't, and he says recite, and that's where the first surah of the Quran uh, tradition says that's how it came about. That's what you're referring to.
More than that, but that is that's one of them, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
I would say as far as connections between Joseph Smith and Muhammad go, I would say the hypersexuality, the way that the holy books they produced were produced, facilitated through angels and that kind of thing. Um, those two ring very, and then the other thing too, it's like because even Muhammad felt that he was restoring the true church in a sense.
Yeah, that
So
there'd been this corruption of
exactly.
the biblical text, of the gospel, right? Yeah.
So I find similarities there, and so it's one of those things where it's like it's fun to speculate and maybe dip your toe into it, but I wouldn't say that I have a firm position on that. But I would say that it's interesting that there are so many similarities, not just between um, Mormonism and Islam, but also between these other heresies and sects that pop up.
Mm-hmm.
It's always kind of the same story, and we had that because the LDS Church isn't the only restorationist movement. You had the
Yeah, no.
Campbellites,
Mm-hmm.
and I think the
You have
Seventh Day Adventists.
Jehovah's Witnesses,
Yeah,
Christian
and
Scientists, Christian
Pentecostals.
Philadelphians. Yeah.
Yeah. So to me, it seems like if I were to take that position, I would say it's the devil playing his same usual tricks.
Interesting. Yeah, see, and both as far as Muhammad are concerned, but also other religious movements, I tend to take the opposite position, where I'm like, wow, these are like really inspired, or like God worked through these inspired individuals to perhaps like raise the standard of morality, or issue like legitimately inspired scriptural texts, or things like that. So yeah, I tend to be pretty, I don't know if you want to call it like pluralistic or like universalist, or things like that in
Sure.
my theology of other religions, but that's typically my approach.
The issue that I have with that is you get into truth claims, and
Mm-hmm.
for example, like if we were to say oneness Pentecostals, it's like
Right.
you can only, there's only so much common ground you can find theologically with oneness Pentecostals
Mm-hmm.
or Jehovah's Witnesses.
Mm-hmm.
So I think I politely disagree on that one.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So let me explain how I kind of make it work.
sure.
Because kind of the framework that I'm operating on isn't so much like a priority of truth claims, right? even though I do hold them as very important. And like if we're speaking like philosophically or like ontologically, I do believe in like the law of non-contradiction, right? That we can't have two things ultimately be true at the same time when they, espouse contradictory positions, right? So you won't see me approaching like different faiths and being all kumbaya and we all worship the same God and stuff like
Yeah,
that, because I'm actually very critical about that approach to different religions, because I think it downplays the differences and it downplays the very particular ways in which they disagree with each other, right? So I'm not trying to blend those or harmonize those in any way. Even though that, I'd say that you could argue that there's shared values in different religions, compassion, service, things like that. It's all fine and good,
absolutely.
right? Truth claims, that philosophically, I think is in a different category. But I think, so I have a personal theology of like, this gets into like epistemology, but then also like other religions and whatnot. But I see the priority in both like mortality, but then as far as like other worldviews are concerned, on individual progression, right? So I would not believe that God can lie to you and say that this is true in like an absolute sense, and then that's not actually true. But what I would believe is that God might impress upon an individual to convert to a given faith, or to have a conviction of a particular faith, if it's within the best interest of their eternal progression. For whatever reason, that's where the lessons are that they need to learn, or just the experiences that they have to have in this life. I do believe that God works through other faith traditions, and that he it's kind of like there's some similarities in like the concept of common grace, perhaps. But I do believe in a God that answers the sincere prayers of different individuals across the world, irrespective of their religious affiliations or identities. That he can work miracles in different religions. But I'll bring a personal example into it. So like when my mom left the church, for instance, she essentially, like after a long time of like trying to study and figure it out, and really conflicted and whatnot, she kind of decided to give it a one kind of last ditch effort, where she attended the temple, and perhaps she was fasting. I know she was praying there, but that was like her sincere question is, do I remain in the LDS church, or is it okay for me to leave? And when she was in the temple, she claims to have received a very strong impression, a peaceful one that's very resonant in the descriptive language that a lot of Latter-day Saints would use, that she felt like it was okay to leave the LDS church, and
Interesting.
that God loved her just as much. And so just that personal story and kind of the background that I'm coming from, at a very young age, I had to kind of figure out, like, was that legit, or not, with my mom, with other people around me. I've also been involved quite a bit in interfaith activism and kind of ecumenical work. And so I spent a lot of time with different religious communities. So, I personally believe that God can, and I think he did, inspire my mom to leave the LDS church. And that was done because it was in her best interest, as an aspect of God's plan. Whatever lessons she needs to learn on her journey. Her journey took her out of the LDS church, but I do legitimately believe that not everyone in this life is meant to be born, live, or die a Latter-day Saint, and that numerically speaking, like just today, only 0.002% of the earth would be a Mormon, like a baptized Mormon. What do I do with all these other people? I legitimately believe that God can work through them, can work with them, can inspire them, but that doesn't necessarily mean that God is issuing a statement on the veracity of their faith claims, if that makes sense. And I would hold that same standard towards LDS faith claims as well. I know it's common for Latter-day Saints to, especially missionaries, right, to emphasize the Book of Mormon, to that you need to pray about the Book of Mormon to know if it's true or not. And while I think, it's possible to seek spiritual witnesses and have sincere spiritual experiences with the Book of Mormon, I think we need to be careful about the particular truth claims that we are trying to establish in relation to that experience, because I differentiate between the experience and the interpretation of that experience, which many might feel leads them to believe that the work is inspired, or that it's historical or something like that. I want to be very careful about how we're interpreting our experiences and what we're claiming with them.
Interpreting the experiences is very, very important. I agree with a lot of what you said, that God is not. I don't think that God is limited in his activity to within the church.
Yeah, and I think the Orthodox tradition is actually a lot more open to recognizing that, or having a more perhaps inclusive theology than some other Christian traditions are when it comes to other people of other religious faiths.
I think it would depend, but in general, in my experience, what I said is my impression of what's true. That God is not limited to in his activity to within the church or even just within Christians. But what you said, I think, is very important, that interpreting what the source of that inspiration is and what it means, the implications, I think that's very important, because if we look at the spiritual experiences that Muhammad had, I think it's, again, I have very serious doubts as to whether or not that was authentically the angel Gabriel interacting with him. I don't believe that. So, but then again, it's like there are, I think about this book I was pointed to about Saint Innocent of Alaska, who came from Russia to preach to the Inuits in Alaska. And the very interesting, I think it was a diary that I read, but it was talking about, I think it was a letter from Saint Innocent to the leader of this new faith community that he had planted. And he was basically saying, the spirits that you have been communicating with, we determined that they were of God, so you don't have to stop there. But if you notice that the spirits tell you anything that contradicts what we have taught you, then be very careful and back away from that. Don't do anything contrary to what we have taught you. But basically the idea is just that not every spirit is evil or even good, and so finding a healthy, reliable way to discern that is important. And I think exemplified with what I just described is the church, I think, is ultimately the best determiner for that kind of whether it's authentic or not.
And what you were saying reminded me of what is it, Galatians 1, though we are an angel from heaven preach to you a different gospel, then let him be accursed, right?
Exactly.
That's a common one that evangelicals like to pull on Mormons and Muslims too. But so I think there's validity to that for sure. I think it's more difficult for me to identify when I feel like someone is when someone is definitely being inspired of a demonic force than it is for me to recognize a good force. I don't know if that makes sense, but
it does.
There have been times in my life where perhaps I've experienced things that I would attribute to a genuine, evil force. And
likewise.
Those are very distinct and actually quite frightening. But in terms of I feel like I have a greater capacity to, in engaging different religious texts or traditions or things like that, to be like, oh, this seems inspired or whatnot, and then the rest seems more neutral than specifically saying like this seems like demonic, like
Yeah.
that's the origin. I think there would be traditions where I'd probably feel that way, probably ones that lean more like heavily like spiritualist, and seem to intentionally like invoke those type of powers.
Definitely.
Um,
Yeah.
but yeah, in terms of like actually like going to just like another Christian church, and even like seeing like infant baptism or something, I wouldn't be like, oh my gosh, that is just like so satanic, like these poor people, like,
Yeah.
So yeah,
Well, yeah, and
it's
likewise, I've never felt the only time, never in my years as a Mormon, but the only time I ever felt like something isn't right here was I attended, no, I'm not going to name the church. I attended a church where speaking in tongues was very much a part of the culture.
Mhm.
And I definitely felt, I'm not saying that this was a satanic thing, and
Right.
I felt the demonic presence, but I definitely felt something was wrong there.
Mhm.
You talked about having experiences that may have been demonic, and I only have one experience of mine that I'm very certain
Mhm.
was something of that nature. And so if that for me is a 10, then my experience at this Pentecostal church was maybe like a 3 or 4, but
Mhm.
it registered on the scale is the thing.
Right. Mm. Yeah, it's fascinating.
Yeah.
Well, it seems we kind of took a little bit of a tangent there. I don't know if you want to talk about apostolic succession. I kind of need to go by, like I'm fine doing another probably 45 minutes or so if you'd
Okay.
like, just
Yeah,
as long as you want to go.
and yeah, we can go 45 minutes. That's one thing that I'm trying to be more conscientious of is some of these podcasts I do go like 2.5 hours, and I
Yeah.
try. It's like even myself as an audience, it's like I can't, like I love Joe Rogan.
Yeah.
I can only listen to like an hour at a time, so I'm
Right.
constantly trying to bring things down. I'm going to change the format in the coming months, which I think will help. But
Mhm.
anyways, I'm going to go ahead and set a timer for 45 minutes. Actually, I'll set it for 40 minutes so that that gives us a grace period. Are you fine with 45?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Just really by like 9 o'clock, like I need to uh,
Oh, okay. Well, yeah, that's easy
do
then.
something else. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Is there anything else we want to talk about on the Book of Mormon?
Yeah. I think I'm all good if you are. I shared my thoughts on it for sure. But we're not so much like debating like it's historicity or so.
Yeah.
Um,
I think that, so I mean, like we talked about, I guess you'd say like its origins and the literary stuff, but just as sort of like maybe the last thing to talk on, because I'd like to talk about the Book of Abraham and the Joseph Smith translation of the Bible too, but the historicity is a big issue to me too,
mhm.
because I mean we have various early LDS people for a long time. In fact, if I remember right, up until only the last 50 years or so, the general consensus was that it took place in North America, and now we have these different models of like where it took place. Is it a limited geography or
Yeah, so I can actually speak to that if you'd like.
okay?
There's a couple different models that have been proposed throughout LDS history. The predominant one for the longest time was called the hemispheric model, where it
Yeah.
wasn't just North America, it was also South America, because internally the Book of Mormon describes like a land northward and a land southward with a narrow neck of land in between. And so a lot of early readers, and it became kind of in the cultural tradition and conceptualization, had this view that it was a hemispheric model. There was some kind of early Latter-day Saints down the road who started noticing that would be problematic for a couple different textual reasons. The Book of Mormon describes like travel times it seems like shorter distances than two continents, right?
Yeah.
Where it there's an internal geography in the Book of Mormon that is pretty consistent with each other, with itself, there's only about 2 or 3 instances where the geography has like a contradiction or some type of error. Other than that, we're able to do like a conceptual map of the locations described, the several hundred geographic locations named and described relative to one another with the different travel times involved. And so there's like kind of approximations of like what that geography might have looked like relative to each other. But yeah, it was because of that. It was also because of the demographics described within the Book of Mormon. That even though you do have numbers being described upwards in the millions as far as the populations are concerned, there's still, for the most part, a lot of times just in the thousands, the hundreds or the thousands or the tens of thousands. So while they are, civilizations, surely, there seems to be this this demographic necessity that it's not hemispheric as well. So there, that's some of the textual reasons that people started shifting to a limited geography. Besides, feeling that because the problem also with a hemispheric model is basically like if Mormons were to say that every instance of like native archaeology or something like that, some type of site, comes from Book of Mormon peoples, all it takes is to find one or more sites that doesn't match what's described to be like, okay, this is like a huge problem, right? So yeah, I think the limited geography is actually the more textually faithful reading that seems to fit better. My ancestor actually, I don't know how many generations back, his name was Jaxon Washburn. He was one of the first early proponents of it. And that was that started taking more form in the 1920s, even though there was earlier people. So you mentioned that early Latter-day Saints believed that it took place in North America. And while it's true that they identified the hill that Joseph Smith supposedly received the golden plates from as the hill Cumorah, that was something that didn't actually originate with Joseph Smith, that was kind of culturally assumed for the longest time, because the narrative of the Book of Mormon describes the hills the plates being buried in a hill, and then later it's the angel that's identified, Moroni, who leads Joseph to those plates. And so readers naturally associated the two hills with each other, but that it wasn't until years later that Joseph Smith actually referred to the hill as Cumorah. Before that, it was just the hillside that he got the plates from. So that seems to be a development that's not strictly required by the text. So during Joseph Smith's life, especially in Nauvoo, we start getting the first glimpses of some of the archaeological discoveries in Mesoamerica, some of the cultures and civilizations described there. The conquistadors and others had already passed through the area, and so there'd already been like Spanish records and things like that of the massive populations that lived there, indigenous populations. But in terms of like explorers and historians actually getting into that area and having like detailed drawings, there's in particular one publication that became popular in America at the time that Joseph Smith and the early saints in Nauvoo, so in the 1840s, were able to get their hands on. And Joseph Smith was absolutely so surprised by the details and the drawings in here, because it seemed to confirm what he had been saying all along. He and the other saints acted and responded as if this was like a vindication of their belief in the Book of Mormon, that like finally they have something to point to and be like, wow, this looks definitive. So Joseph Smith did feel that at certain parts of his life, that it was likely that it took place in kind of a Mesoamerica or like Central America type setting. You have other early Latter-day Saints saying that like Lehi and his party landed in the southern tip of like Chile, and then others holding to more of like a Great Lakes type region or like a Heartland region. And so yeah, those different geographic sites, the two main ones today would be kind of the Mesoamerica theory, because that seems to have the most plausibility with the civilizations and the technologies and things like that described by the Book of Mormon. But then there's also the Heartland theory, which only requires there to be one hill where the plates were deposited.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's the one flaw with the, or not, not necessarily flaw, but it's the one non-textual presupposition that's required, that during the time frame where Moroni gets the plates, there's a 17-year-old, there's a roughly like a 17 to 20 something year time frame between him, like the Nephite civilization being wiped out and him going into exile in the wilderness, and then finally him closing the record and depositing the plates. So there's a significant amount of time there that those who hold to a Mesoamerican theory would say it's plausible that he escaped and was able to make his way on foot up to North America, where he deposited the plates in the hill nearby Joseph Smith's home. That's a non-textual assumption, and you could argue its plausibility, but I don't know. It's interesting. Surely, in terms of explanatory power and like the potential correspondences within the different civilizations, I do think that Mesoamerica, if you're going to make the argument that it's historical, it's easier to make a historical argument with Mesoamerica because they were the only literate cultures, that was the only literate area of the ancient New World. They're also the only ones that used cement as a means of architecture, that seemed to have the population numbers that matched the Book of Mormon size, the kind of warfare that's engaged in. And it's not all perfect by any means, but it's easier than saying like the mound builder Indians, or like the Mississippi tribes, or the Hopi, or those ones were far less advanced than some of the cultures that we find in Mesoamerica. So this is why I said earlier that I do lean towards Mesoamerica if we're going to pick a theory, but in terms of identifying a set place, I'm somewhat agnostic. I don't think it's within our current means to verify. But you were saying that was like kind of a hang up for you.
Certainly.
Yeah, and that's understandable.
Well, there's a few things that I think about, because Brigham Young, I think he told his congregation about a story. I think he was retelling a story from Oliver Cowdery that Joseph Smith took him inside a cave in the Mora, and there were wagon loads of artifacts, and there were more gold plates.
Records like all over the place.
Yeah, and so there's that, and then there's another record I recall where Joseph Smith was describing Illinois as he was describing the Indians who lived in Illinois as descendants of the Lamanites. And then there's also Joseph Smith identifying Palenque, which is in Central America, as a Nephite or Lamanite city.
Yeah, you can also throw in the example of Zelph, during the Zion's Camp March, Joseph Smith, like seeing the different mounds and associating the skeletons with, perhaps like Nephites or Lamanites.
So it seems like the hemispheric model is the one that Joseph Smith was thinking about, because you have the North Americans and the Central Americans, like both being involved here. And something else that I kind of noticed is like there's, correct me if I'm wrong, but wheat and barley in the Book of Mormon, and those only grow in North America. They don't grow in Central America.
So we've found barley, like barley relatives, or like barley in Mexico.
Okay.
So it's not just strictly North America, I would say. The wheat is more of an issue than the barley is, I think. But yeah, as far as like if you're talking like a tropical region, Mexico is like the best place, or Mexico would be the closest place for something corresponding to barley.
And we're talking about Veracruz, like southern Mexico, Guatemala.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, like the Yucatan Peninsula type. Yeah. I want to agree with you that Joseph Smith did, make those statements, and that he seemed to also associate not just with Mesoamerica, but other places. I instead of viewing it all like holistically and saying that it's he had a hemispheric model, I think he did early on. but I think his kind of view about where the Book of Mormon took place developed over time as he, perhaps encountered different kinds of literature or artifacts or things like that. Because the Zion's Camp experience, where he's identifying like the skeletons, this one's Zelf, and he's like a white Lamanite or something like that. That's in the 1830s, right? It's prior to Nauvoo, when he comes across this publication about the civilizations in Mesoamerica. So I think I'm pretty willing to say that like I'm open to Joseph changing his mind on the subject, and like kind of like his personal theory like evolving over time. Even if he died believing it was like a hemispheric type location, I think I'd be comfortable with that. I don't think it would bother me too much, just because I feel like that's something that he is trying to make sense of within the framework of his own environment, and it doesn't necessarily reflect an explicit like prophetic claim. But yeah, I can certainly see how Book of Mormon historicity or archaeology is a major sticking point for a lot of people, especially if you compare it to that of the Bible, right? I think it's completely, it's undeniable that the archaeological and historical work that's been done to authenticate, at least like the geography or like the narrative, some of the narrative elements of the Bible.
Yeah, far
surpasses that of the Book of Mormon. I want to qualify that and say that like if we're just talking like Mesoamerica, for instance, we have essentially a landmass the size of the Indian Peninsula, the Southeast Asian Peninsula, the size of India, essentially, where there's been virtually like little to no archaeological work done there. Let me explain that. So recently they've been doing LiDAR studies. LiDAR is like a means of in like, let's say the jungle, right? It's very difficult to actually, the canopy makes it impossible to see anything, right?
Laser imaging.
Yeah, essentially. And so they fly over and they're able to throw lasers down and have like reconstructions. And so there's been all kinds of studies coming out with that have doubled, tripled, quadrupled our population estimates for the civilizations in that area. And it's estimated that even before that was done, that out of all the identified sites, the historical sites that we've identified, only less than 1% have actually been excavated, right? So the terrain is pretty sucky. It's tropical, it's humid. In terms of like organic material or metals or things like that, the jungle breaks it down very quickly, right? It's very different than, let's say, like the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, where we have this like very like arid desert type climate that is very much in favor of like if you're going to preserve like a text thousands of years, that's a really good place to try to do that. The odds are in your favor. The amount of funds, the amount of manpower, hours, research that have been poured into the old world versus the new world are totally disproportionate to each other. And so this is where my agnosticism comes in, because I look at the statistics about like what we've actually uncovered. Book of Mormon, irrespective of the Book of Mormon, what we actually understand about the ancient cultures and civilizations in the New World. I'm like, oh my gosh, like we have so much more to understand. We've identified dozens of languages, and we can only, actually translate like 2 or 3 of them with any degree of confidence. So I think there's a lot of room for any of us, faith claims aside, to be pretty cautious in the conclusions we make about what that area of the world looked like, because I just personally think it's like steeped in mystery, and that's one reason why I'm skeptical both of people's ability to verify Book of Mormon sites, given all that we don't know, but then also the argument that because we haven't verified anything yet, that means there's nothing to be found, right? So I don't know. It's interesting for sure.
If I were LDS, I would be encouraged, because it seems to me that the two choices essentially boil down to either the mound builders in North America on the one hand, or the Veracruz region
Yeah,
of
yeah,
the
like
Central
Mesoamerican.
American.
Yeah,
So it seems to me that it's like, all right, at least you have limited things to study. And
yeah,
then
I
just
agree.
as a sort of aside, because I definitely agree, it's not even anything to agree with. It's just a fact that
Yeah,
our archaeological work that's been done in Central America and South America for sure is very, very much underdeveloped.
yeah, for
Um,
sure.
so, and I've said before in discussions and stuff, like all it would take for me to seriously question where I'm at in life would be the discovery of something concretely LDS. Like if we found a monument to Nephi, or if we found
Yeah, or if
a
you
city with,
Zarahemla or something like that,
yeah,
yeah. And
um,
yeah, and I think that there's been some really compelling arguments for that made in the old world, such as with like I don't know if you're familiar with like the Nahum, uh,
yeah, I haven't
thing.
found that
I
terribly convincing.
Yeah, and maybe that's a conversation for another time. But yeah, as far as New World stuff, I don't think there's any kind of convincing evidence for identifying a particular site. And you're not the first person to tell me that either. Both the first
Sure.
non-Mormon or ex-Mormon, um, that all it would take is like, oh my gosh, like something concrete, and I'll be the first to admit it would be nice, as a person of faith, like it would
Yeah.
definitely alleviate like this kind of jump of faith. I don't think it's terribly blind, right? Because I try to make it as informed as possible and be straightforward with its limitations. But yeah, I'd be the first to admit it'd be nice, if there's more stuff. I think the historical trend has been in favor of the Book of Mormon in terms of like if we take anachronisms for instance, there's been lists of identified anachronisms by critics over the years, comprising several hundred different elements of the Book of Mormon, whether we're talking bees or honey or wine or uh, elephants or populations in the millions, right? Critics have read the Book of Mormon since it was published and said like this was not in there, this was not in there, and since then, since our archaeological and historical understanding of the New World has progressed, a lot of those things have become either demonstrable or at least plausible within a New World setting. So that's also something that I've been that kind of trend I think has been strong in favor of the Book of Mormon, even if it hasn't come with any concrete instances that like this is like a Nephite relic or something like that.
Yeah.
Like take the instance of like building with cement, for instance. That's described in the Book of Mormon. At roughly the same time, we have quite a bit of archaeological evidence within like Central America of them also using essentially an equivalent of like cement and like limestone or quicklime to build structures and housing and stuff, and it's unique to that area. And so something like that, I'm not saying that those structures that we have today are indeed from the Book of Mormon, right? But suddenly it at least becomes plausible, right? Because we found an instance of cement in a New World setting. So yeah, yeah, I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
The only
Not
thing I would say
cement in
is
particular,
because
but like, yeah,
the only thing I would say, and like unless we pulled up the list and went through point by point ourselves, which I don't think either of us have interest in doing, but um, I can't remember if this was on one of those big compilation lists, but the idea of being able to make iron or steel,
yeah.
big
Metallurgy is a big
metallurgy,
weakness for the Book of Mormon right now. Yeah,
and I've seen the explanation like, well, they do because they had these little like trinkets, little metal
yeah.
things,
No,
and I didn't find that convincing at all, because it's like, okay, to make these big golden plates that must have been, I forget the dimensions, but they're fairly sizable compared to these little, like when you actually look at what they made that was
hmm
metal, it's paltry.
yeah. Well, I think probably the better argument to go with that is the description of like so the Book of Mormon doesn't always describe swords and armor and weapons in terms of like metallurgy. Sometimes it's ambiguous, where you could make the argument that it doesn't explicitly say that it was made of metal, but there are instances where it says like steel swords or like,
I think
you know,
there's 2 or 3.
yeah, iron or things like that. And so yeah, the metallurgy is a big weakness, a big weak point for the Book of Mormon. Although to its favor, over the years, the date at which the non-Mormon Mesoamerican scholars believe that they became sufficient in metallurgy, or they started to have these skills, that date keeps getting pushed back and back, closer, or perhaps even overlapping now with some of the Book of Mormon years. So there is this trend where it keeps getting pushed back, but as far as like anything within that time frame, I wouldn't say there's been anything to that kind of scale, because like for instance in like First Nephi, you have Nephi describing them coming to the New World, and pretty quickly after they come over, he says that they find like ore in abundance and they start like smelting it and stuff, and that we're talking like 5th century BC at that point. So it's that's a big area. The domestication of animals, I think, is another weak area. The animal populations described, while some of them have been verified, there's other ones like traditionally you hear about horses. Horses aren't mentioned a lot in the Book of Mormon, but even if we're just talking like ram and like sheep and cattle and things like that,
and aren't chariots mentioned as well?
Yeah, chariots are mentioned, I believe, twice in the same. They're only mentioned in like a single kind of like context, but they're mentioned as well. And so there's been ways that different Mormon apologists or Mormon scholars have tried to tease out different possibilities with the text, or perhaps we're taking it too literally when it reads chariots. So like for instance, the Hebrew word for chariot that's used in the Song of Solomon actually is a platter, like a carrying platter, but it's the same word for chariot. I don't know, different things like that where they might nuance the meaning, or they might be like,
Sure.
well, it might be a matter of translation either on Joseph's part or on ours or something like that. So yeah, there's areas where I think there's been some interesting developments, others where it's still clearly problematic. But yeah, what I was saying with the domestication of animals, domesticating them, not just the species, but them on such a mass level, that's one area that would need more verification. The LiDAR stuff has shown that there were like animal pens, and like there was domestication of animals in different contexts, but they were probably the wrong species, because we're talking more like jungle type animals. I don't know, like what is it, like the tapirs, capybaras,
Zabumafu.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't think they have monkeys in.
Do they? Yeah, I don't know.
No, I think they do.
I don't know. I don't know if.
I know they don't have lemurs
in
in Central America. Are monkeys only in Africa? No, monkeys are in Asia too.
Yeah.
I don't think monkeys are in Australia. Monkeys are monkeys.
We're
in
talking
South
about
America?
this like high level nuanced stuff, and like we're both a bunch of idiots. We don't know if there's monkeys in South America.
You bring up Zabumafu, and it just like
I'm glad that you know what Zabumafu is. I didn't know.
Yeah, of course, man. That was my ish growing up. Like,
there you go.
He was my dude. Funny thing with that, like because I was born in '98, so I don't even remember 9/11, which is so like technically I'm a '90s kid, and
technically
arguably like somewhat a millennial, right? But I like to gauge who a millennial is based off if they remember 9/11 or not. I think that's probably the best kind of cultural qualifier. Just when I was younger, there'd be the starting theme of Zaboomfu, where he's like leaping all around the place. Leaping, where I'd be leaping all around the house, and I don't know, it was funny.
Yeah.
Anyways, this is an interesting tangent. Was not expecting to discuss this.
I guess to sort of like put a stamp on the Book of Mormon stuff. I would recommend. I sincerely recommend, because it's actually a non-biased source. It's something totally unrelated, basically. But are you familiar with Graham Hancock?
Yeah,
Oh,
actually,
okay, yeah, because he's actually kind of a
yeah,
proponent now for, look, we need to look into South America, Central America.
yeah,
This,
his like lost civilization stuff. I
yeah,
don't always find him convincing. Like sometimes I
yeah,
think he's like doing pseudoscience type stuff, but there's other times where I'm like, all right, like this is he's making some good points. Like when he brought up because this is from Joe Rogan when I've listened to him, and he
yeah.
brings up I think it's called the Antikythera mechanism. This kind of like primitive computer that dates to roughly like maybe like 1000 BC or 100 BC, found off the coast of Greece or something. And it's actually like a super complex like navigation device, like computer. And he's like, what the hell is this?
Yeah.
Where does this come from? People can't explain it. Top 10 things, atheists can't explain. So, um, yeah, I think there's there's good reasons for us to be, to take the existing historical record with a grain of salt. And, irrespective of faith claims, like I am a very strong believer that, there's a lot that we don't understand. There's so much that hasn't survived. Like I lament, my heart hurts when I think about the Library of Alexandria,
Oh my goodness. Yeah.
and just all the ancient manuscripts, not just there, but just in general, like I think estimated it's like less than 1% of all ancient manuscripts have survived until today.
Yeah.
So yeah, actually that was a major thing they were talking about at the Bible conference that I attended, just comparing like the textual reliability of like the New Testament, right? Compared to a lot of these other like ancient works, where you're lucky, with these different philosophers, to get an example of their work within a couple hundred years, of them dying. Most of them come within, I don't know, like the average is like maybe like 700 to 900 years after some of them are known, right? And then we only have like maybe a dozen total collections, right? Instead, with the New Testament, not only do we have portions dating within, let's say, 100 years, but we also have
Easily.
we also have just such like a rich textual history. So many ancient manuscripts, complete manuscripts of the New Testament, that the comparison that was made was like, so like the average like, let's say, ancient text or something like that, if we line up its manuscripts or something, would be the size of like, let's say, a podium. Okay.
Yeah.
And if you lined up, if you compared that to a same kind of visual representation of New Testament ancient manuscripts, that would be the size of 4.5 Empire State Buildings.
That's
just astounding.
Really, like, not only that, but there's other stuff too. But really, like, I honestly feel that people who believe that the person of Jesus Christ did not exist, I put them in the same realm as flat earthers and
me too.
like ancient alien people.
Yeah, Christ mythicists like just bother me so much because like
nothing will convince them.
Yeah,
and the funny thing too is it's like you want to talk about verifying people for a lack of primary sources. It's like you can't therefore accept that Pythagoras existed.
Yeah, or like Herodotus or these other
And I think even for Alexander the Great, there's only, I think, 1 or 2 primary sources for his existence.
And they're within like probably 200 or 300 years of his death, So yeah, I totally agree. Like flat earthers have no meaningful conception of like historical criticism or like, historical methodology, because if they did, then they wouldn't just, label Jesus as a myth, but literally essentially like every other ancient historical figure as well. So yeah, I totally agree. They're annoying because I can at least like respect like secular or like naturalistic scholars who don't see Jesus as divine, right? But like they'll be like, clearly there was a Jesus of Nazareth, like Bart Ehrman is a great example of that, where he's like, come on, like it's demonstrable, even though he believes that like the divinity aspect was developed later. in the Christian tradition. I don't understand why, because they're only arguing it from within their worldview, right? And typically
Exactly.
these are people that are claiming to be like the true like rationalists and the true critical thinkers. I'm like, come on, like it's so clearly biased that that the only reason you're singling out Jesus for this is because you have like kind of
Your own bias.
an anti-Christian agenda, if you will. So
We have 12 minutes left, and if we get to the deity of Christ, fine. But for the sake of the people who voted, we should definitely cover apostolic succession.
yeah, sorry about that.
Yeah, no sweat. So I'll take the lead on this and just say
It's all good.
it seemed like a fairly cut and dry thing for me, because we can trace our line of priesthood succession, priesthood ordination back to the apostles themselves.
Mm-hmm.
And my understanding is that Peter, James, and John, the apostles, appeared to Joseph Smith in, I don't know if corporeal or incorporeal, but they appeared to Joseph Smith and bestowed upon him the keys of the priesthood.
Mm-hmm.
Is that correct?
Yeah, I would say so. Yeah.
Okay.
And that's claimed to have taken place prior to the organization of the LDS Church. So like this is like essentially in 1830. This is claimed to have taken place.
Right on. See, and I'm trying to think like what we can actually have a conversation on this, because it's like you have your view, I have my view. So I guess for the sake of creating some tension, I guess we could get back to whether or not Joseph Smith's priesthood is valid. Because as I mentioned before, I would argue, I think it's evident that the restoration was trying to restore something that didn't need restoring.
Mm-hmm.
So
well, since I'm gonna have to get going pretty soon.
Sure.
Just the few comments I'll make. That it's my belief that the contemporary Latter-day Saint conception of the priesthood is not one derived from antiquity. That it does not match what was practiced or espoused within the early Christian church or within ancient Israel. I think there's some correspondences or some elements, which can be said to, parallel that of the biblical tradition or, practiced within ancient Israel or maybe in the early Christian church. But especially like the bifurcated LDS priesthood, the Aaronic priesthood and the Melchizedek priesthood, I don't see that existing in the same way anciently. Within the Old Testament, I do recognize like the Levitical priesthood, the hereditary line of Aaron, by which the priests operated. But the thing was, it was hereditary, right? And we don't see the Aaronic priesthood functioning that way within the LDS Church today, right? So there's a major difference. As far as the Melchizedek priesthood goes in antiquity, I would say that it was often invoked by kings, those who did not possess the hereditary priesthood, a kind of higher priesthood for them to still act in priestly capacities in ancient Israel. So such as like David and others, they might operate by the non-hereditary Melchizedek priesthood, which allowed them to officiate because Melchizedek, right, he's described as a priest, and yet the Bible doesn't claim that he is of the line of Aaron, right? And so there seems to be this kind of this concept of the Melchizedek priesthood anciently, that it's not hereditary. Often it was associated with royalty. It's spoken of, perhaps in like the Psalms, and I know like Hebrews as well. Like the book of Hebrews talks about this kind of Melchizedek priesthood. I don't think you can completely derive like the contemporary Latter-day Saint conception of the priesthood to it. But I do think that at least those terms existed anciently. And so the way I often see it, especially as far as the early church is concerned, is just seeing it through the lens of the power of God, right? So I would probably agree with you that there are churches that exist beyond the LDS church, especially the historical ones, not just the various Orthodox churches, but also, you know, perhaps the Church of Rome too. You know, I know a lot of these churches, these ethnic Christian churches have, you know, apostolic succession lines, you know, where they can trace their priesthood through different bishops or whatnot, you know, going to the apostles themselves. So that's not what I dispute, because I think that's completely plausible. I see it through the lens of like the actual like authority to act in God's name and like the power of God and kind of like a sanctioned authorization. So for me, it's not just a question of like, can we trace ourselves back, but is, you know, God actually authorizing this, right? And that's, I would say, more subjective. That's not just something that we can turn to the historical record and be like, you know, clearly like, you know, Joseph Smith has the true authority of God. That's more of like a supernatural or a spiritual claim that I think would be more, even though it's influenced by a conversation about history, I don't think is strictly determined by history, you know.
I would agree.
So yeah, and so in terms of like the Christian apostasy, that's what I would say would be the tipping point, where even though you do have a Christian tradition branching off in different respects, churches being in communion with each other, councils, people who can trace their lines back to the apostles. It's that kind of institutional, like singular institutional authority to act in God's name that I would consider being the point of difference. That doesn't take away the sincere Christian witness, the martyrdoms, the miracles, the legitimate spiritual experiences, or you know, convictions of early Christians and Christians, you know, throughout history. But yeah, as far as that like specific like institutional authority, I would consider that to be what was primarily lost during the apostasy.
At what point do you think the apostasy happened? And
I don't think I could identify a singular point. I think I can identify different things which set it in. So because we do have that kind of like you know, ordinations and things like that that can be traced back to the apostles. I do personally believe that like perhaps different Christian communities fell into apostasy at different times, right? So some might have, you know, lasted longer than others. And I think as far as the New Testament is concerned, you do have different apostolic figures describing, you know, perhaps a falling away or like certain churches no longer recognizing that apostles' authority or things like that. So, you know, we do start to kind of get hints of that in the New Testament. We do obviously have like like historical heresies that spring up, you know, within the early church, both in the New Testament times, but also, you know, leading up into the different ecumenical councils. I would consider one of the biggest things that kind of sealed the deal was both the various councils that take place, the creedal councils, such as Nicaea or I always mispronounce it. Is it Chalcedon or Chalcedon? Or,
I think both are totally acceptable.
Yeah. Okay. Chalcedon and oh shoot, there's like one more I'm forgetting.
Constantinople.
But, you know, Constantinople. You know, these different councils, especially where we see the theological belief in the Trinity being more and more reified and like specified and reinforced. I'm not specifically arguing that was created at like Nicaea or anything, but as far as like the formal creedal conceptualization of an orthodoxy around these creeds, you know, those are produced as a result of the councils. But I do think that the institutionalization or the nationalization of or imperialization of Christianity early on by Rome, for instance, I see that as very problematic. And I think
Interesting. I see it as very, very good.
yeah.
Yeah.
And maybe we'll have to do a future episode where we talk about that.
I
And you
would
did
love
talk,
to.
yeah, and you did talk about you mentioned your master's work. You know, I'll readily admit that early Christianity, as much as I'd like to dive deeper in it, it's not as much as my forte as much as, like, you know, perhaps like LDS church history or Book of Mormon stuff, right? And so I would love to do, you know, have future conversations with you where we're able to broach this
Yeah.
more in depth, and, you know, I can rely more on your knowledge there.
Yeah. I mean, I see kind of a balance there, because while I see myself definitely, like, I think I'm pretty familiar with
Yeah,
the LDS world.
yeah,
You know, it's like you're better there, and I'm probably better on early
hmm
church history. Just
yeah,
responding to what you said, though, um, it seems, it doesn't seem, it seems very evident that the mentions of apostasy, for example, in, I think it's Second Thessalonians, it mentions a great falling away. The
yeah,
context within which that is couched, it's it's tied to the coming of the Antichrist, and so that's
hmm
something to come in the future.
hmm
And yes, we have various communities falling away and that kind of thing, but we see Christ's promise that the Holy Spirit would guide us into all truth, the promise that the gates of hell would never prevail against the church. And you could read that on multiple levels, but
hmm
essentially it seems strange to me, the idea that Christ would come and make those promises, and then either Christ was a liar, or
hmm
or he just was incompetent.
Yeah,
Because
I do find that in conversation with different Christians, like, they'll totally agree with me that, you know, there was indeed legitimate apostasy in early Christianity, but it's this
it happens
concept.
today. It's
Yeah,
something that has been
yeah,
happening
yeah,
even
yeah.
since the time of
It's
the Israelites.
it's the idea of a global, or like a universal apostasy.
Universal
You know,
apostasy.
yeah, that would be the major difference.
And a clarification too I would make on the ecumenical councils. The ecumenical councils were all called defensively.
Yeah,
Orthodox, and I guess Catholicism to an extent, at least for the first 1,000 years, the church would only define things. The church was very reluctant to make definite affirmative statements. The councils were all called defensively,
yeah,
to clarify when
because,
something
like, a
came up.
particular heresy you know, comes up. Yeah,
Yeah. And we're currently at 9 o'clock, so I think we'll
yeah,
wrap
that's
up
fine.
now. So we can do another one. I would love to.
Yeah,
But yeah, I mean, my thesis, and maybe for next conversation, but my thesis is all about tracing the affirmations made in the first two ecumenical councils, which affirmed the deity of Christ and the deity of the Holy Spirit, and tracing those beliefs back through the early church,
yeah,
the Ante-Nicene fathers and the Apostolic fathers. And I think it's very interesting finding, because, like, I wish I could show you. I have all these books here,
yeah. I bet.
but you find everything that's affirmed in the Nicene Constantinopolitan Creed.
hmm
Everything is still being taught by, I mean, St. Ignatius, Hippolytus,
hmm
Theophilus, all of these early church fathers, some of whom knew and were disciples of the apostles
Right.
themselves.
Yeah.
And so then you have to ask yourself, all right, well, were Polycarp, St. Irenaeus, and Ignatius, were all these people led astray by the apostles? And I don't know. It
hmm
we'll get into that one another time, I guess.
Yeah.
But yeah,
That'd be great. Well, thank you, John. I appreciate our conversation, and, you know, I thought it went pretty well. I enjoyed it. So, you know, I'd love to, like I said, come back and continue it too, just because I know we picked out 3 topics, but those are 3 rather big topics, and,
yeah,
you know, time is short, but, yeah, I'd love to pick them back up at a future date.
yeah. Let's do that. Maybe in a few months or so, because I got to
Yeah.
catch up on some stuff. But yeah, we'll definitely do it again. I enjoyed
Okay.
the conversation, and again, just like, as far as I don't know, like, I see conversations like this as very important, especially. I don't want to go political, but it's like there's so much polarization nowadays that I
Yeah, I
think
agree.
dialogue is so important, because when you find that you can't have a conversation anymore, the only thing that's left to do is to act.
Yeah.
And when people who are frustrated and angry act, it's not a good thing. So
Yeah, for sure.
I think the
Yep.
more we humanize each other and show love toward each other, so much the better.
Yeah. This is the antithesis of Twitter, right? And I think humanity very much needs that.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, cool,
Okay,
man.
man.
I hope you have a nice night.
Likewise, I appreciate it, and we'll talk again.
All right. See ya.
Farewell.